So welcome to another episode of On Air with Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer. This podcast, number 18, is titled The Legend of Atlantis, The Phoenician Connection. And it's part one of a multi-part series. And this comes off the back of some exceptional research by my co-host, Phoenician Hunter. Welcome, Phoenician Hunter.
Hello, it's good to be back. Yeah, like you said, this is going to be a two-part series. So we'll only cover the first article in this talk and then follow it on in part two with the rest of the evidence that we're going to present.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'm excited to dive into this, let's call it a legendary tale, which explores the fascinating connection between Atlantis and the ancient Phoenicians, which you will go into. So in today's podcast, we'll unravel clues, examine the history, and see just how far this connection goes. So, to our listeners, sit back, relax. Let's enjoy the journey into the world of Atlantis and the Phoenicians. So let's get started.
Everyone is familiar with the story of Atlantis, and everyone has their own thoughts and ideas about it, from being an allegorical metaphor to which historians lead towards, and to, others exploring it and finding that, this is a superhuman race of advanced people with advanced technology and flying machines and all the ridiculous things that have come out of, the story of Atlantis that we need to be mindful wasn't in the original text. These are ideas and thoughts that have been, brought on by other researchers and authors at a later date. But, the idea is that, there was once this race that pretty much were the dominant species and ruled the world, at some point. What I found was, researching Phoenicians over the years, I kept seeing similarities and connections with Atlantis being brought up through various books that I've read, and I just wanted to uncover that and see what I could find and if there was any truth to it. That's what got me started on writing this article.
Okay, great.
What are your thoughts about Atlantis, and just give me some of your thoughts? Again,
I'm not going to steal your thunder, but you are going to talk about Plato's Timaeus and Critias, which was said to have been written around 360 BC. I've read bits of that, but my knowledge of Atlantis doesn't go as deep as yours, obviously. All I know is that from Plato's work, that it was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, I think they're called, which we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar. But my recent discovery was more around the theory that it points to the Azores Islands. Now, I'm not sure if we're going to talk about that, but that's, if for anyone that doesn't know, they're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and some believe that it's the remnants of Atlantis. But again, this is a new fascinating theory that it's come up, and it's yet to be proven. There's no solid evidence to back it up, but in my opinion, I think it's unresolved. So whether it's Azores or not, whether Azores is Atlantis or not, is still open for questioning. But this is where you come into the story.
Well, that's interesting you brought up the islands, because we discussed those in a previous podcast, which was called New Age Romans, and they found some Phoenician coins there, or Carthaginian coins there.
So there was,
again, that connection. This is what I'm talking about. There's that connection with, what some perceive as Atlantis or the remnants and the Phoenicians.
So again, this is just one theory. There are many, but what I'm interested to know is, and as I said, this is where you come into the narrative, based on your research, which is a lot deeper than what I've ever gone through. I'd like to hear your version.
Firstly, this is important to stipulate, is that in my research, I wanted to stay close to Plato's original writings. And this is where I believe many researchers, especially over recent years, get it all wrong, because they move away from that and they take later opinions and later ideas, and they've removed themselves completely from the original text. That's important, that I wanted to stay close to that.
Sure.
And a lot of people do it for marketing purposes too. Of course, they want to sell a book.
That's right.
Hey, advanced technology, and they do this with Egypt, and I see they do it with everything. And people fall. I'm sorry, people fall for it.
They do.
The biggest selling books on this stuff is aliens, advanced technology, flying machines. With Egypt, and they're doing it again now with Egypt today.
Oh, with the laser scanning.
Look, I'm just not going to comment on that until some time has passed, because I've been there before, and they come out with this sensationalism and all this stuff early on, and then slowly they back away from it, or they slowly debunk it. Well,
can I just say something to that? And it only happened literally in the last 24 hours. I came across a video which I thought was real. that they had actually travelled down these pillars, these so-called pillars, and they were showing. And let me tell you that this video footage looked absolutely amazing. It was AI generated.
Yeah, that's the other scary bit. With AI, they can create these,
And this is what we need to be careful of. And this is why your research, and for our listeners, they should go to phoenicianhunter.substack.com or to go to the podcast at youtube.com/ on air podcast 2025, all hyphenated, because you dive deep into the narrative and you use texts that haven't been
well, they're not common.
altered in time, and they're not common, correct? It does all begin with Plato, and what we're told is that the ancient Greek philosopher first introduced Atlantis in, as I mentioned earlier, Timaeus, which is said to have been written roughly around 360 BC. Is that correct?
Yeah, so remember that date, 360 BC, because I'll be referring to it quite a bit, and it's an important part of my research. So Plato called it the island of Atlas, and I believe he did not intend it to represent, the pinnacle of human achievement or this advanced race with supernatural abilities. So the standard expert's view is that it's meant as an allegory for the arrogance or corruption of nations. So, when people get corrupt, they fall. In the story, Atlantis is described, this is an important point, as a naval empire, right? Naval empire that ruled all western parts of the known world.
Oh, so this is merchants. This is a nice little connection.
But we're not saying that now. This is
no,
what,
of course, yes.
What Atlantis is described as by Plato. Okay, so that should be already a clue to a lot of listeners. What is he referring to there? So, in brief, after a failed attempt to conquer the Greeks, the ancient Athens, Atlantis falls out of favor with the gods, right, through corruption, and is punished, and that's when it submerges under the Atlantic Ocean and disappears.
Well, when you say submerges into the Atlantic Ocean, things that I've read talk about a massive earthquake that happened, which I believe it's a common myth, and you can probably clarify that. What evidence do you have to suggest that it did submerge, for example?
Okay, no, I don't believe there's much in the theory that a landmass submerged under the sea. I've looked into other researchers who just claim that that's not possible, but that's not. I didn't want to explore that part of it because I don't think it's important to discovering who these people really were. So,
right.
But I do believe that parts of Plato's Atlantis are based on actual events, and that this naval empire that ruled all parts of the Western known world were in fact the Carthaginian Empire, which we've mentioned before in other talks. So we need to realize around this time, the Persian Empire is the great empire or the great power of the East, right? But it was mostly a land-based power, and it never really extended its influence far westward beyond Egypt. We are told that this Persian Empire finally had a navy around 500 BC, but what we find is that this navy was built and manned by Phoenician sailors. So, this great empire didn't even have their own sailors or shipbuilders. They used Phoenicians, okay?
Yeah.
Although the Phoenician city-states in the east came under, Persian rule at this time, they were still allowed considerable freedom, right? And continued to flourish at this time as shipbuilders and merchants and traders. So,
right. And there's a quote from your article which ties into this quite nicely, actually, which says local Phoenician kings were allowed to remain in power and even given the same right as Persian governors, such as hereditary officers and minting their own coins, and could continue to conduct their political and mercantile affairs with relative freedom.
Yeah, so for them, nothing really changed. What we need to understand is that, Phoenicia and the merchants, they don't care who rules the empire as long as they're allowed to control the trade. So we still see that today. And I've said this many times, the merchants move with the empires. Okay, so it doesn't matter. They can work and be successful under a foreign governed empire as long as they have the means to control the money supply and the trade. Again, so historians say that at the time of Plato's account, which is 360 BC, okay, let's remember that date.
Which we mentioned earlier, yeah.
Yeah, that the Carthaginian Empire was the dominant power of the Western world, okay? So they were the dominant power of the Western world. As I said, Persia is to the east, but the Phoenicians still have the ability to run their business as usual. So To the west, it's this empire. They have naval dominance of the Mediterranean Sea. And we are told that Carthage was the richest city on earth at that time. So it was the superpower of the West. So recall what Plato said, that Atlantis is described as a naval empire that ruled all western parts of the known world. So who does that sound like? So although the Phoenician cities in the east are under Persian rule, their main power base now has moved to the west in Carthage. In order to be a superpower, you need, or a financial superpower, a maritime superpower, you need to control trade. And you need to control trade in both the east and the west. And this is what's happening here. So the Phoenicians are still in control in the east under the Persian Empire, and they control it in the west, in the Mediterranean, through Carthage. It's one entity. It's not, I don't see them as two, separate.
Okay. Well, if I can reintroduce Plato into the discussion, and a quote of his, which you've intentionally highlighted in your research. He says in his writings, according to Critias, 9,000 years before his lifetime, a war took place between those outside the Pillars of Hercules at the Strait of Gibraltar, which I mentioned at the onset of our discussion, and those who dwelt within them. The Atlanteans had conquered the parts of Libya within the Pillars of Hercules, as far as Egypt, and the European continent as far as Tyrrhenia, which is central Italy, which obviously the Tyrrhenian Sea leads onto the west coast of Italy, and had subjected its people to slavery.
Great. So that's a quote from Plato, right? Like I said, I'm going directly to the source. So this is an interesting point, that the Phoenicians and later the Carthaginians controlled the entrance to the Pillars of Hercules for the hundreds to 1,000 years. So they had control of that area. And the territories that you mentioned, Libya, Egypt, central Italy, were all under Phoenician influence at some point. So he's mentioning that they control these areas, and they're the exact areas that the Phoenicians had control over.
Yes.
So my reading into this, and the evidence always points to the Atlanteans being the Phoenicians, or the Phoenicians being a remnant of the Atlanteans, which we'll get to later.
Yeah.
And the two Pillars of Hercules marked the western limit of the known world. And we've mentioned this before, that the Phoenicians were known to have sailed beyond this point, to discover Britain, to sail around Africa, and as we've discussed, to even colonize America at some point.
US, yes, of course. And we cover that in more detail later in the podcast. Well, we cover this in more detail in our podcast, which our listeners can go to, which is called Staying on Course and New World Romans. They can access that and several others, as I said, for free at youtube.com on air podcast 2025, all hyphenated. So my understanding is that they blocked the entrance to the Atlantic, essentially to control trade and discourage competition.
Yeah, exactly. And they're the ones that were known to have spread these stories about the perils of the outer sea, that there were sea monsters beyond this point, or even you could sail off the edge of the world. And I've mentioned that that whole flat Earth theory,
of course,
gives birth to that theory as well.
Yep.
And it was, like you say, to discourage competitions, from other merchants. And we have to come to the realization that the Phoenicians themselves probably created the myth of Atlantis, again to discourage competition, to keep their knowledge of foreign lands a secret.
Yeah.
Okay, and was America, the American continent, part of their empire? And that's something we've also discussed before. This is used today. Common practice is to make yourself seem powerful, invincible, and then you actually it's called it's state propaganda, and everyone uses it. So maybe the idea of Atlantis, they created that to say we're this powerful, advanced race. Don't mess with us, kind of thing.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about the blockade and tall stories that were done, but they, as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, not necessarily on the issue of Atlantis, but how merchants and naval powers frightened others, was to talk about sea monsters and so forth, which is quite believable now when you read it back in those times. But in Plato's writing of Timaeus and Critias, he also writes that starting from a distant point in the Atlantic Ocean was insolently advancing to attack the whole of Europe and Asia to boot. And that's obviously a modern day translation. Yeah.
So I'm not convinced that there was a continent that sank. It's more likely that America, is this distant point in the Atlantic Ocean that he's referring to here, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And a lot of researchers into Atlantis have made a connection with Central and South American cultures as well there, and how they were influenced by a Semitic, they call it a Semitic race that I say could have been the Phoenicians. So there's connections with that landmass and a Phoenician culture. So there's the link there. There's a link there to America. Moving on, in response to this invasion from the Atlantic, we are told that the Greeks led an alliance against the Atlantean Empire. And in the end, Athens prevailed alone because the rest fell away. So Athens alone prevailed against the Atlanteans and liberated all these occupied lands. So for me, firstly, logic tells me that, okay, the Atlanteans could not have been this super race of humans with advanced technology. Otherwise, how would Athens defeat them? We know about the power of Athens through history, so they couldn't have beaten this super race alone,
right,
unless, like I say, they were bigging themselves up. They didn't really have advanced technology, and they weren't, a super race. Again, you got to stick to the original text to see what's happening here.
Of course, but going back to, again, my introduction earlier, and you've mentioned this throughout the chat, is you focus on the importance of the date 360 BC. Can you maybe weave its relevance into this discussion?
So Plato tells us that the story of Atlantis was passed down through Egyptian priests, and the event took place, I believe, like 9,000 years before his time. But let's not forget that Phoenicia and Egypt were closely related as well. There was a lot of Phoenician influence there. They traded with them. They were pretty much their navy at some point. So there's a connection there with Phoenicia and Egypt. So when they're saying that the story was passed down by Egyptian priests, again, I see a connection there with Phoenicia. So the story might have been through the Phoenician priests passed on to the Egyptians. Okay. But what I find interesting is that at the time of the writing of Plato's account, which is that date, 360 BC, the Greeks are at war with the Carthaginians, at that exact time. Another coincidence, for control of the Western Mediterranean, right? And this struggle ensued for over 300 years. That's a long time to be at war, 300 years. So now, I was thinking about someone else, like the author J.R.R. Tolkien, right? When he wrote Lord of the Rings, he wrote it during World War II, right? And some say that, this story is a direct allegory for the war that he's experiencing at the time, or at least had a major influence on his work. You cannot write something during an event like that and not have an influence on what you're writing. It's almost impossible. So,
well, you can also include Ian Fleming to this, because he also, during the Second World War, wrote all these spy stories which ended up becoming the James Bond series, right?
So I'm thinking that Plato's writings of this Atlantean story were influenced by these wars with the Carthaginians, because it's written at that time. So
it makes sense. And, what we have access to in the history books, and when I say history books, and we've mentioned this before, is those written prior to the late 19th century. They tell us that these wars were known as the Sicilian Wars or the Greco-Punic Wars, which, again, to elaborate, these were a series of conflicts fought between ancient Carthage and the Greek city-states led by Syracuse, over control of Sicily and the Western Mediterranean. And this happened roughly, and correct me if I'm wrong, between 580 and 265 BC.
And this was primarily for control of trade.
Yes.
Who gets to control the trade and the wealth of the Western world? So after the Greeks sued for peace, they couldn't defeat them. Carthage enjoyed a brief, unchallenged period for only a year, because within a year, Rome enters the scene and takes up the fight. And these are known as, the famous Punic Wars. And again, they fought for almost 100 years as well. Carthage was Rome's greatest enemy. But after many years of fighting, Rome finally destroys the Carthaginian Empire. And we can that's another podcast in itself. But so it took over 400 years for the combined efforts of Greece and Rome to finally destroy this once naval superpower of the West. So, when Plato says Atlantis is described as a naval empire that ruled all western parts of the known world, to me, it's clear to me that who they're talking about here.
Of course.
400 years to defeat this empire, they're pretty major power.
Yeah, which justifies my point earlier that we know that history is written by the victors, right? And you've mentioned this in previous podcasts. So perhaps the original events were, let's say, changed or buried.
Yeah, so this is why we have the story as we have it.
Mm,
And, it's sort of mythical because a lot, we need to understand a lot of the knowledge that we have of the Phoenicians was either lost or rewritten. We have
mm,
I don't think we have any records directly from Phoenicia. It's all secondhand knowledge and passed down through other cultures and
mm,
other nations. It's because when the Phoenician Empire crumbled, the last one was Carthage,
mm.
their records were destroyed by the
Of
Romans.
course, yeah, of course. Well, which brings us to another quote you've highlighted in your research, and I'd like to know a little bit more about this and who it was attributed to. In the year 146 BC, they, referring to the Romans, burnt the great city of Carthage, their ancient enemy and the incalculable superior in everything relating to science. The Library of Carthage is said to have contained about 500,000 volumes.
That's a lot.
It's huge. It's like, the Library of Alexandria. And these no doubt dealt with the history and the sciences of Phoenicia as a whole.
So again, you bring up the point about Alexandria, and I believe that this could be what they're talking about when they
Right.
write about the destruction of the Library
Okay.
of Alexandria.
Okay.
See, you see throughout history that very similar events happen in two different spots under
Of
two
course.
different names.
Yes,
But I
yes.
think it's the one event and they're trying to hide it. So this is where I think this is what they're talking about when they mention the burning of the Library of Alexandria, where all the knowledge of the world was lost. You know what I
Yes.
mean?
Yes.
So, and also all their deeds were discredited by their enemies, the Greeks and the Romans. So what
Mm,
we know about them was given to us by the Greeks and the Romans. So then they're rewriting it to make them evil. They were the evil people. They were involved with child
mm,
sacrifice,
mm.
etc. And this is where all these stories
Sure.
come from. So what we have is probably the largest conflict in history, a 400-year period of conflict
Massive, massive, yeah.
between this Western naval empire against the emerging powers of Greece and Rome.
Yeah.
We only ever received one side of this story. We only get the Greek and Roman side of the story. And it's a
Yeah.
bit like World War II. This happens again and again, where Germany, the one side is accused of all the horrors imaginable,
Sure.
wow, the stuff that is off the charts, ridiculous,
Yeah.
hard to prove. And the winners, of course, are always the good guys, and lucky for us that the good
Well,
guys always win. They don't.
and we're not gonna focus on World War II, but and again, this might be a controversial statement, but when you say that it can't be proved, there has been the narrative since the late 40s that Germany destroyed or killed or murdered, 6 million Jews, for example, where we actually know the figure is actually around 276,000. But again, the narrative is written by the victors, right?
I mean, when you can't question certain events, who's controlling it? Well, I'm going
Absolutely.
to say on that.
Yeah, that's okay. And we can just leave it at that. But as a bit of a heads up to our listeners, we'll discuss this in part 2 of our next podcast, where you'll obviously uncover even more evidence to this topic, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Yeah, what we've discussed in this podcast has just touched the surface of the evidence between Phoenicia and Atlantis. We've just touched on a few points, and in part 2, we'll discuss further evidence. The way I end this particular article is by saying that until as late as mid 1600s, the Phoenicians were relatively unknown as a culture. They knew very little of them. And the first full book ever devoted on them was published in 1646. So it's quite late. And what we did know about them, like I said earlier, came from the accounts of other civilizations, and it was mostly their enemies. So if everything we know about them comes from their enemies, you're not going to get a true understanding of who these people are and what they did. And it's just like Atlantis. We know very little, and
Yeah.
this is why I'm suggesting that are they connected in some fashion?
What a great discussion yet again that we've had. For our listeners, are there any closing comments?
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to sort of discuss a few points. Firstly, I want to thank everyone who has become a paid subscriber and who have given donations as well. Your support is much appreciated. And really, if it wasn't for, the paid subscribers, I probably wouldn't even be able to continue doing this. So, yeah, big thank you. Another thing is, this brings me up to another point that I wanted to raise. I get a lot of comments and questions regarding things that I have already addressed in older articles. So I've come to the conclusion that people who become subscribers tend to read just the most recent posts and don't go back and read the earlier ones. And for me, they're just as relevant and probably more so than the new ones, because I laid the foundations there, in the early articles. And like we've mentioned in the past, that all my articles link to this larger story that I'm trying to tell. So I encourage people who've subscribed and bought a paid subscription to go back and read those earlier ones, because they're a crucial part of this larger story. And, as of today, I think there's like 46 articles. So, there's plenty there to keep you busy. And another thing is paid subscribers also get access to a digital copy of my book, The Secret World of Words. There's a post there dedicated to that. You can click on it and you've got free access to my book. If you want to get a hard copy, obviously you'll have to purchase that through Amazon. Otherwise, it's there for you to access. That's all I wanted to say.
There you have it, folks. It's Atlantis, a mystery that continues to captivate our imaginations. Again, remembering that this is only part one of a multi-part series that Phoenician, Hunter and I will be discussing over the next few weeks. Whether it's a metaphor, an allegory, a lost civilization, or a race of superhumans with technology beyond our imagination, which you've just proven today that it's not necessarily the case. You have to admit that the story of Atlantis still holds countless interpretations. So personally, I couldn't ignore the similarities and connections that kept coming up in reading your work, and of course in the last 30 minutes of our chat as to what the truths might lie beneath the myths that we've been sold. Nevertheless, we combined, you and I, continue to look for answers, and judging by your research, I think that's probably the most accurate that I've come across. So look, over the next few weeks, as I said, we'll uncover more about this enigma, let's call it. I'm very much looking forward to continue this discussion. So thank you, Phoenician Hunter.
Thank you, and till next week.
Till next week, thanks for joining us on part one of this journey. Until next time, stay well.